Resident Evil 9, officially titled Resident Evil Requiem, is almost here, and Capcom might be making the same mistake that nearly divided the fanbase back in Resident Evil 6. After 4 trailers, hype is at an all-time high, especially with the reveal of Leon's campaign. But here's a twist. Developers say Leon's gameplay will focus on pure pulse-pounding action, intentionally moving away from horror, while Grace's story leans fully into survival horror. 2 different tones, 2 different playstyles in one game. And we all know how that turned out in Resident Evil 6. So now the big question is, will Resident Evil Requiem succeed where Resident Evil 6 failed? Are they making the same mistakes they made in Resident Evil 6? Is Capcom repeating history? Before we dive in, please like and subscribe and let's get into it. Resident Evil 6 released in 2012 and quickly became one of the most controversial games in the entire series. It immediately split fans down the middle. Some players hated it while others enjoyed it, but very few truly loved it. The ones who liked the game considered it to be a decent third-person shooter. It was faster, bigger, more explosive. It was packed with action, but many hardcore fans disliked it because they were hoping for a survival horror experience. They judged it as a Resident Evil game, not as a shooter. They went in expecting tension, vulnerability, and careful resource management. Instead, they found something entirely different. Think of it this way. You go to a restaurant and order steak. You wait patiently, eagerly for your order. The plate finally arrives. You start cutting into what looks like a nice juicy steak until you realize something, that this is not steak. This is cake. Now, there's nothing wrong with cake. It's a great dessert. But the problem is that you wanted steak, not cake. And that is why some players absolutely hated Resident Evil 6. It was marketed as a Resident Evil game. It carried the name, the branding, and everything fans associated with the series. But to many hardcore fans, it didn't feel like Resident Evil at all. Now, you might ask, how is that possible? Look here, the title says Resident Evil. The game is even filled with iconic characters like Chris, Leon, Ada, and even Sherry. They even continued the long tradition of alphabet-labeled outbreaks by labeling the next outbreak the C virus. On paper, it has everything a Resident Evil game should have, and that leads to a much more important question. What actually makes a Resident Evil game a Resident Evil game? If characters, lore, and viruses were all that mattered, then Resident Evil 6 should have been universally loved. But compare it to Resident Evil 7, a game many fans consider one of the best entries in the entire franchise. Some even argue it single-handedly saved the franchise from absolute ruin. And yet, almost everything familiar in that game was gone. No iconic cast, and no established setting. We took control of Ethan Winters, an unknown protagonist trapped in an unknown place, hunted by unknown enemies. And no, Chris showing his face for a few seconds does not mean he is in the game. Even the central virus barely takes focus until much later on in the story. For most of the game, we are alone, isolated, vulnerable, and somehow that felt more like Resident Evil than Resident Evil 6 ever did. This is why understanding what makes Resident Evil unique is so important. The series has never stayed the same. Many people point to Resident Evil 4 as the first major transformation, the moment the franchise abandoned fixed camera angles and tank controls and instead opting for over-the-shoulder perspective. And sure, that was a massive change, but the truth is, Resident Evil had already been evolving long before that. Resident Evil 1 placed us inside a mansion where zombies were actually scarce. You weren't overwhelmed by numbers. Instead, terror came from intimacy. Sharing a narrow hallway with a single zombie was enough to send shivers down your spine. You were alone, hardly interacting with other characters, so the moment you spotted another character, it felt like a sigh of relief, a moment of safety that you had earned after surviving on your own for so long. Resident Evil 2 expanded the scale, more zombies, more ammunition, but then Mr. X was thrown into the mix. He was a stalker. He turned familiar hallways into danger zones. Suddenly movement required planning. Every room mattered. You needed to know where you were going before you moved because Mr. X was always close, always searching. The sound of his footsteps were never too far behind. Resident Evil 3 evolved even further. It was the first game to introduce dodge mechanics, counter systems, and ammo crafting. And yet, you never felt powerful because this time Nemesis existed. The Nemesis did not stalk you. He actively hunted you. No matter matter how prepared you were, the game constantly reminded you that you were being hunted. Resource management still mattered. Jill was still vulnerable. Safety was always temporary. And yes, before anyone asks, I'm using clips from the original Resident Evil 3 here. I'm still waiting for Capcom to release a remake for Resident Evil 3. Capcom released Resident Evil 4 remake, but they decided to skip 3. And no, this is not Resident Evil 3 remake. This is called a cash grab, a DLC without a soul, just not a Resident Evil 3 remake. But we could talk about it in another video. The important point is this: every one of these games introduced change, new mechanics, new ideas, new ways to play, and yet fans embraced them. So why did these changes work while Resident Evil 6's changes didn't? The reason is actually simple. Capcom reinvented the experience without abandoning the essence of Resident Evil. Change was introduced, mechanics evolved, pace shifted, but at their core, these games were still about survival horror. Resident Evil was never about killing zombies. It was about surviving them. It was about surviving the horror itself, the place you found yourself trapped in. Could you survive the zombie blocking your way in the tight hallway of the mansion? Could you endure the Raccoon City Police Department while being stalked? Could you escape a city that was actively hunting you? Vulnerability, isolation, and tension never left you, not even for a moment. Combat wasn't empowerment, it was desperation. Every encounter became a decision. Do you spend precious ammunition to eliminate a threat, or risk slipping past it? If you fail, can you afford to use one of your last healing items? And if you survive this encounter now, what happens the next time you walk down the same hallway? Suddenly, every decision matters. Your inventory space matters. What you pick up matters. What you leave behind matters. Every choice has a consequence. And then add isolation to that equation, and the fantasy changes completely. You are not an action hero punching your way to victory. You are vulnerable, outmatched, trying simply to survive. And that feeling is the true identity of Resident Evil. These core foundations are what shaped the Resident Evil experience. They are the bread and butter, the very DNA of Resident Evil. Ask anyone who played Resident Evil 6. Can you remember a single moment where you aimed at a zombie and genuinely hesitated? Did you ever wonder if it's smarter to shoot or to avoid the encounter entirely? How often did you carefully think about your inventory, your ammunition, your healing items? Before leaving a room, did you route your path to avoid danger? For most players, the answer is no. Now compare that to the mansion or the Raccoon City Police Department. Many fans can instantly remember a time they stood still and asked themselves, should I shoot? Should I run? Can I afford this fight? Those questions defined Resident Evil, and in Resident Evil 6, those questions simply didn't exist, which reveals something important. Capcom didn't just change Resident Evil, they abandoned the very essence that defined it entirely. This shift was framed as evolving the series, expanding its audience, modernizing the experience. But in simpler terms, they were just chasing a trend. The late 2000s and early 2010s were dominated by shooter games, Modern Warfare, Battlefield, Gears of War, each raking in millions in sales. Capcom wanted a piece, and Resident Evil 6 became their bet. Iconic characters like Chris, Leon, and Ada returned to reassure fans. Even the title font looked darker, scarier, in an attempt to convince people that this is still Resident Evil, but beyond the title, it was unrecognizable. I mean, at best, Resident Evil 6 can be described as a horror-themed shooter, not survival horror, and in trying to reach a broader audience, Capcom risked losing the very fans who defined the series in the first place. I'll admit something, Resident Evil 6 is the only numbered Resident Evil game I never finished. I completed Leon's campaign and stop there, and before anyone asks how I can judge a game I didn't fully complete, I told you before, I wasn't looking for cake. I took one bite and realized it wasn't what I came for. So what does Resident Evil 9 have to do with Resident Evil 6? Well, everything. The developers have already confirmed that Resident Evil Requiem will feature multiple campaigns with dramatically different playstyles. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Looking back, Resident Evil 4 marked the first major shift moved toward encouraging combat. Enemies dropped gold, allowing weapon upgrades, which became central to progression, which meant engaging in combat was rewarded. But Resident Evil 4 never abandoned survival horror entirely. Despite the increased action, you still felt isolated while navigating the unfamiliar town. Resource management remained essential. The game even introduced a new inventory system that added a new dimension to item management. Strategic decision making was still front and center in that game. Resident Evil 5 pushed combat even further, but this time isolation disappeared with the introduction of a permanent partner, fully changing the emotional experience. It became more about cooperation and less about isolation. Then came Resident Evil 6, where they decided to throw everything else outside the window. Combat dominated everything. Survival mechanics? Gone. Item management? Irrelevant. Horror? Non-existent. What remained was just the name. But Resident Evil 7 became the reset button. It brought survival horror back to the forefront. Combat was once again a last resort rather than something you actively sought. But Resident Evil 7 didn't just go back to the roots. It succeeded being the scariest entry in the franchise. Then Resident Evil Village followed. It was clear that they borrowed ideas from Resident Evil 4. Enemies once again dropped currency used for weapon upgrades, which encouraged more combat. But unlike Resident Evil 6, Village preserved the essentials. Isolation remained. Resource management still mattered. Tension never truly disappeared, which brings us back to Resident Evil Requiem, a game promising two different experiences within a single title. And the question now becomes unavoidable. Has Capcom found the perfect balance between action and survival horror? Or are we watching history repeat itself? Can Resident Evil Requiem succeed where Resident Evil 6 failed? On the surface, the parallels are clear. Multiple campaigns, multiple playstyles, a broader appeal, and I won't lie, I am cautious. We've been down this road before. We've seen what happens when action begins to overshadow survival horror. But the context today is different. Resident Evil 6 was created during a time when the industry was dominated by shooters. Studios chased that formula because it looked like the future. That pressure shaped Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil Requiem is being developed in a completely different landscape. A landscape where survival horror made a comeback, where tension, vulnerability, and atmosphere are not outdated mechanics, but celebrated ones. If Capcom manages to blend Leon's pulse-pumping action with the core survival identity of Resident Evil, leaning closer to what we saw in Resident Evil 4 rather than what happened in Resident Evil 6, then this might actually work. The developers have described Grace as inexperienced, limited in combat ability, and is forced to manage scarce resources. That tells me they understand what makes Resident Evil Resident Evil. And honestly, that makes me cautiously optimistic. We can't know for sure how it will turn out, but if Requiem stays within the boundaries that made Resident Evil 4 and its remake so effective, holding on to isolation, tension, meaningful resource management, then this may not be history repeating itself. It may be a change done right. But what do you think? Has Capcom learned from the mistakes of Resident Evil 6, or are we about to relive them? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoy this breakdown, consider liking this video and subscribing for more Resident Evil Requiem analysis. Bye for now.